So I'm going to mute everyone. Should you have a question, please put your question in the chat. And then you'll be called on after Christian's presentation to unmute yourself and ask your question. It is a great pleasure to have Christian Volbracht with us this morning. Christian is a German journalist, an amateur mycologist, author, and a specialist in antiquarian mushroom literature. In short, he's a mycobibliophile. He's worked as a news journalist for the German press agency DPA for 40 years, and for 10 of those years, he was head of the agency's Paris office. And he's had a parallel career as to his journalism career as a collector of mushroom books. He assembled a very important private library and built up an online shop of antiquarian mycological books. In 2006, he published Mycolibri, a comprehensive, copiously illustrated bibliography of his collection, covering works from the 15th century to the 20th century. And a supplement to Mycolibri appeared in 2017. The two volumes of Mycolibri are now recognized as really the standard bibliography for mycological literature. It is an invaluable resource for mycologists, book collectors, dealers, and research librarians. He's also the author of Die Truffel, Fake and Facts, published in 2020, a book on the scientific and cultural history of truffles. He lives in Hamburg, Germany, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Christian Volbracht.
Yeah, Tom, thank you very much. Welcome to Hamburg from all over the world. That's a great opportunity to speak to you. Perhaps I will add at the beginning some remarks on I have to just arrange a bit here. Okay, I had to reorganize my screen a bit. Okay. Yeah, I think I started my career as a specialist in old mushroom books almost 50 years ago, when I found a small mushroom book in the bookshelves of my grandfather, who introduced his grandsons to mushroom hunting. And I became more and more interested in mushrooms, became a member of the German Mycological Society, and started collecting books and later trading them. This result is the private collection and the bibliography Mycolibri. Mycolibri now is a small business run from my private apartment, and it's, I think, the only bookshop in the world dealing exclusively with books on mushrooms. There are about 4 catalogs per year. The last one just came out some days ago. And I'm sending emails around the world to announce when it's again online. In my collection, or in my bibliography, there are about 5,000 books and prints from the 15th to the middle of the 20th century. And I am a part of this work, particularly fascinated about truffles, the history, the legends, the many stories. And so this is my second private hobby, to find out more and more details about all the lovely sometimes false and sometimes correct stories and truffles. But let's go to the subject. I want to explain the history and the techniques and the problems of mycological illustrations, the different periods of woodcuts, copper engravings, color engravings, etc., and then coming to a special aspect of the interesting period of the 18th century when the first great colored iconographies were published. To start, let's go back to the earliest printed fungi illustrations. They appeared in the Hortus Sanitatis, published in Germany in 1491. This is one of the first printed botanical books. These are woodcuts. The images were drawn on a block of wood, then the parts that had to be left white between the lines were carved away with a knife. Later, ink was rolled over the remaining relief and the block pressed onto paper for printing. Often these images were also colored by hand. I have to go back. Yeah, the rough pictures of this period gave only an approximate idea of the represented mushrooms. Here we have the Agaricinum in the herbal book by the German Hieronymus Bock and the Italian Pietro Andreas Mattiolus. And this is considered to be the first clearly identifiable species of mushrooms. It is Fomes officinalis. A large step in advance was made by the Flemish-Dutch scientist Carolus Clusius. In 1601, he published his Rariorum Plantarum Genera, the first monograph on fungi, describing the mushrooms found in the region Pannonia in Austria and Western Hungary. These figures of fungi exist also in a hand-painted manuscript now in the library of Leiden in the Netherlands. Real progress was possible only in the second half of the 17th century, after the invention of the microscope and the increasing use of copperplate engravings. The microscope made possible the observation of tiny details. The copperplate engravings allowed their exact reproduction. For engravings, lines are cut and hatched into metal plates. These lines hold the ink. The metal plate and the paper is pressed between rollers, and the result was a much finer and more detailed image. With these inventions, the English Robert Hooke became the first to show in 1665 in his Mycographia the internal structure of larger mushrooms and of microfungi here on the left side. But sometimes imagination was stronger than observation. Have a look at the fanciful plate on the right, a geaster like a group of tiny men and women. The image was first published in a scientific journal in 1661 by the German Seeger. We come to Sterbeek. This was a Dutchman from Antwerp. He published in 1675 the Theatrum Fungorum. This is the first copperplate book nearly exclusively devoted to fungi. Sterbeek copied most of his images from the original drawings by Clusius. On the left side, a picture with the author on the mushroom market in Antwerp. On the right side, the lovely landscape with sheep and mushrooms. The next milestone for mycology, the Nova Plantarum Genera by Micheli, was published in 1729 with engraved plates. He discovered the spores. You see the tiny dust on the lower part of the left image. The technique of copper and steel engraving later became more and more sophisticated. In black and white, this art reached its summit 130 years later after Mycological with the brothers Toulon from France. These detailed engravings resemble to pictures from the electronic microscope. This is an absolute summit of mycological illustration. Now, we come to hand-colored copper. In the midst of the 18th century began the period of colored copper engravings. The earliest example are by Weinmann from 1739. He used the mezzotint technique. That means he printed the plates with colored inks. The inks were spread directly on the metal plates. The images are not very satisfying, I think, so more progress was demanded. Here we have a work by Schmiedel. He was the first to publish hand-colored fungi plates, coloring the printed paper. He is depicting Clavaria and many Gerstrom species. These plates were clearly superior to those of Weinmann in the picture before that. In 1759, followed the first hand-colored mushroom book by the German Jakob Christian Schäffer, The vorläufige Beobachtungen der Schwämmer. This is a forerunner of his masterwork on the mushrooms of Bavaria. The plate on the left side is by Sophie Beetz. This is the first female illustrator of mushroom books in history. I recently published a paper on women as fungi painters in the German Journal of Mycology. In France, Pierre Bouillard invented a completely independently new printing method for colored copper engravings. He drew and engraved the plates of his Herbier de la France. He mixed the inks himself and color printed his plates. For this, he had 3 tint plates, each engraved for the individual tones necessary to print separately the blue, red, and yellow of each image. The paper of the plates therefore has tiny holes in the corners to fix it good for the next color printing. Bouillard died as a rather young man. His technique was forgotten. But Bouillard is one of the best examples for the opinion of Linnaeus, who said that the best book illustrations are made by the botanists who are excellent scientists and artists as well, and who supervise closely the printing process. Later on, to the Danish botanist Theodor Holmskjold. This is for me the highest level of quality, sorry, with hand-colored plates. His plates were colored in gouache. The painting covers completely the lines of the copper engraving. These are wonderful artistic miniatures. This is Clavaria militaris. In France, 2 examples from Paulet and Rock from 1790 and Rock from 1832, rather strongly colored. Here, the most famous mycologist of the period in England, Bolton and Sowerby. On the left side, Bolton, on the right side, Sowerby. And now we move on to the next progress in printing. This was the hand-colored lithography. Lithography was an invention by the German Alois Senefelder in 1798. It is based on the principle of repulsion of oil and water. The images are drawn with wax chalk or another oil-based substance on the surface of limestone. The drawing lines then are fixed with acid and later washed out to hold the ink for printing. White areas were sealed with sour gum arabic and then watered. So the oily ink for printing is repulsed and the watered sections, only the lines of the original drawings are printed. Litho stones were usable many times, more often than copper plates. The images show more details and nuances. Very often lithographs were hand-colored. The first color lithography in a mushroom book is by Letelier from 1826. And in 1831, the German Lenz published his Boletus Satanas as a hand-colored lithograph on the right side. More examples from this period. On the left side, Korda, with his exciting book about the mold fungi, the Prachtflora der Schimmelpilze. Never pictures of molds have been published in such a large format again. And on the right side, the very colorful plate of poisonous fungi by the French Descourtils. Here we have a lithograph plate by the Bohemian mycologist Krombolz. Even in black and white, it is very expressive with many nuances to see of the fungi depicted. But let's have a look now, the hand-colored version. Very colorful. Of boletes. Later, the lithographic process was used to create multicolor images. This is chromolithography, patented in France in 1837. There was, for the color illustration, a separate limestone was used for each color. So the plate went through the press separately for each color. Up to 21 colors were printed in this way. The earliest mycological chromolithographic illustrations I know is Brunner's work on Polyporus tuberasta from 1845 on the left side. Later, for example, Fries used chromolithography for his Icone Selecta Hymenimicetum from 1867. In the 20th century, the quality of chromolithography reaches its summits from a technical, artistical, and scientific point of view. Here, plates by the French Boudier and the American Farlow. A very fine example is also Lange's Flora agaricina danica. In the US, it was Peck who used chromolithography for his illustrations in the Review of the State Botanist. And in France, the probably last mushroom book with chromolithographs was Romagnesi's Nouvel Atlas des Champignons in 1956. There were also other procedures for illustrating mushrooms in books. One was nature printing. Here on the left side, plants and even fungi were pressed onto a lead plate. The impression of the plate in the metal then was used for printing. The procedure was not perfectly suitable for mushrooms. Only the Austrian botanist Häufler tried it. The French Lucan had another procedure. He cut pasteboards in the shape of the mushrooms, colored these models, and pressed them on the paper. We did this as childs with potatoes. Some images like this one were finished by hand. Lucan was an officer in retirement, and he manufactured a total of 17,000 plates in this with mushrooms with this method. His figures seem a bit stiff, often parading like soldiers. In between a look at Asia, fungi painting in Japan, which is completely different artistic tradition. The illustrations are from the botanical compendium Onsutsufu by the Japanese Tsunemasa Iwasaki. The work first was published as a manuscript and then in 1916 printed in colors. Here we have the traditional representation of plants in Japan with its sense of clear colors and contrast, rhythm and simplicity. Back to Europe and my most favorite special effect by Cook. It comes from his illustrations of British fungi. If you turn this chromolithograph plate of Coprinus on the right side to the light, you recognize that he glued small pieces of broken glass on the surface to imitate the tiny crystals on the head of the species. This was probably cover glass for microscopic preparations. Then at the end of the 18th century, color printing and photography slowly became the prevailing techniques to illustrate mushroom books. Edmund Michael's Führer für Pilzfreunde was in 1895 the first book produced in a 4-color printing. The earliest mushroom photos in a book I know are from Möller's books on the mushroom gardens of South American ants of 1893. And Hollos published in 1904 the first colored photographs of gastromycetes. Here is a picture of the book by Michael on the left side. On the right side, the first book to present color photos from natural specimen. This was from Nina Marshall, published in New York, I think. The competition between drawings of mushrooms and photographs will probably never end. Here's an example for this contest on a high level. On the right side, studio photos by the Swiss Fred Waldvogel and the drawings by the German Ernst Ludwig on the left side. One special, excuse me, my doctor described me a drug that weakens my voice, so I have to cough a bit. I'm sorry for that. Special effects used also in the US were the stereophotography. This method uses two nearly identical photographs, then paired to produce the illusion of the three-dimensional image, usually viewed through a stereoscope. Here, two stereoscopes by the German Kurt Dieterich and from a book by the American mycologist Alexander H. Smith. The stereo photographs of fungi were to admired through a double-lens Viewmaster. Smith's book had 30 different stereo slides. I come now to a tiny section in my talk to artist books. In 1972, Alexander Smith contributed as a scientist to the publication of the great mushroom book by the composer John Cage. Cage was, as you will know, one of the founders of the New York Mycological Society and is famous not only for his music, but also for his writings on mushrooms. The very rare original large format book includes very fine fungi drawings by Lois Long, with scientific descriptions by Smith, and Cage's texts on mushroom hunting, identification, and cooking. The writing is superimposed in several layers, often very difficult to read, mysterious like mushrooms. Cage thought that ideas are to be found in the same way that you find wild mushrooms in the forest, by just looking. Instead of having them come at you, clearly they come to you. As things hidden like Easter eggs. Another mushroom book by an artist, the Canadian Sheila Keeley. She used more than 100-year-old plates for her treatise on mushrooms. She superimposed them with drawings, adding text by Roland Barthes or John Cage. The German author and Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass, famous for his novel The Tin Drum, was also a talented graphic artist. In 1972, he published his book Mit Sophie in die Pilze gegangen, Went to Mushrooms with Sophie, combining drawings, calligraphic text, and erotic poetry. The most exciting artist book on fungi is by the American abstract artist Cy Twombly. His Mushrooms is a series of 10 large format lithographs, a multimedia collage. The work invites us, in the words of the American art historian Eliza Walls, to explore the relation between nature and culture, natural history and cultural history. Let's have a closer look. The artist combines printed mushrooms pictures with photos, diagrams, his own short remarks and scribblings. The small mushroom pictures are from a German popular book. They are partly covered with other elements on the collage. The whole is a mysterious enigma. Sorry. Alicia Wall said Twombly mushrooms both adhere to and defy the history of mycological illustration. I personally must admit that I have not been able to find out which mushroom book, from which mushroom book the small printed images stem. Okay, now we return to the time of colored plates of the 18th century. They are important until now, as these illustrations are sometimes used as iconotypes, the first descriptions of species. How were these plates produced? What do they tell us? The Swiss scientist Karen Nicholson has shown that the images had an important role in scientific exchange and communication. They were admired for their beauty, but they served as models and were even copied by other scientists for exchange of knowledge. The publication of books of images was a complex teamwork between botanists, artists, engravers, colorists, printers, and publishers. The main problem of this period was the fact that the quality of craftsmanship of the people involved was very different and that they didn't have common standards for colors. A good example for these problems is the mycologist Christian Persson, who argued with his editor Amand König about the plates for his Iconis Pictae Fungorum, one of the rarest of all illustrated fungi books. In this letter, Persson complains that the editor doesn't like the plates. He believes, writes Persson, all fungi must have the same brightness as beautiful flowers and brilliant butterflies. A very special and particular role has the color. The great Linnaeus didn't consider colors to be useful for the distinction of species. Linnaeus used the reproduction organs of the plants for classification. The German Jakob Christian Scheffer demands in his first book on mushrooms that all engravings should be colored, but there have been many technical problems more than 250 years ago. Many craftsmen mix the colors after their own different and complicated prescriptions with pigments from vegetables, animals, or minerals. Often plates were colored differently, even the colors had no precise names. So Jakob Scheffer was one of the first to write a book on color standards. His work was intended to serve illustrators as a reliable guidance. On the other hand, it was recommended to owners of non-colored books as a color catalog. Here, a page from this book with red color examples. A later color reference book is by the American ornithologist Ridgway. This code is often quoted in the Rustula by Henry Romagnesi to define the exact color. There are many variations in coloring. Look at these plates from the English and the German translation of Bolton's History of Funguses. The plates were redrawn and colored in a very different way. Here an example to show the different quality of coloring. The work by Cromwell, we have seen it before, has been published in different versions. The first edition has very fine and skillfully colored illustrations, but in a later reissue, here on the right side, the coloring is simple with very few nuances. Many mycologists had their own system for coloring. In France, family members of the mycologist Casimir Gillet were charged with coloring. Gillet gave them sample plates marked with the letter M here on the left side, but apparently the templates were ignored sometimes. Here, two versions of plates in Greville's Scottish cryptogamic flora. On the left plate, we can read the advice, color these carefully. This has been done for the plate on the right side, but it differs in other parts from the model. some differences in plates from Scheffer's great iconography on the mushrooms from Bavaria. It shows that everybody who consults nowadays an old illustration, perhaps as an iconotype, should be aware of the variations of coloring in the 18th and 19th century. Further on, colors in paper change with aging. So it is important to have a look in well-preserved copies of the mycological works in the original coloring. In other cases, authors changed illustrations in later issues of the work. Here, Billiard. He added the fine white net on the stipe of Boletus edulus in a later issue of his plate number 60 on the right side. And my final plate is this one. Here it's from Greville's Scottish cryptogamic flora of 1836. It shows a beautiful cantarellus, but the microscopic details show spores in asci. So this seems to be a sort of an ascocantarellus. The example tells us that the best craftsmanship of the artist, the engraver, and the colorist does not help when the botanist or mycologist did not look carefully into his microscope. Thank you very much. This was my overview.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was fantastic. One thing that came to mind during your presentation was a paper that I think was by Rolf Singer and Robert Mackall,
Yeah.
on using Mycological as the usefulness of Mycological as a field guide.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that paper?
I remember, I've read, I knew Robert Mackall, who was also a great collector of mushroom books. I think his collection was sold to Italy some years before. But the special aspect was using as a field guide.
Yes, yeah. And I wonder if you've had experience with trying to use Bouillard, for example, or as its effectiveness as a field guide, being able to determine species.
Yeah, the problem is if you mean a field guide is something you use in the field.
Well, not that you towed out into the woods.
Impossible with Billiard. But
Yeah.
I think there are many very interesting old images, and when I studied mushrooms as an amateur, I used them very often, and I discovered very many details. The difference between the color drawing and the photography is always that on the drawing you can show all the characters necessary, but you don't find them all at once on a photography, or very rarely. So it's you explain better the details and the different elements which are necessary to distinguish a species.
Right. We have a few other questions. Paul Sadowski, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, I think I checked.
Oh, hang on a sec, Paul, sorry.
Go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead, Paul, sorry.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Yeah, as a publisher of music, I'm curious about what the print runs might have been, through these various eras? Are we talking a typical, like I would assume in the late 1400s, 1500s, they were probably very small print runs.
Yeah. Oh, I think you mean the number of copies which was published?
Yes.
I think these books went to universities and to scientists, and then were used and copied, and very often the woodcuts were reused for other publications, and so you had always a small number, but the distribution in the scientific society was well organized.
Thank you.
Jason Tarakay, and would you like to unmute yourself and ask Christian your question?
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Volbracht, it's an honor to see your face and to be here in this presentation. Thank you so much. And my question for you is, how do you, over the years of collecting mushroom books, how did you kind of keep scope creep in check? Did you always understand exactly what you wanted to collect? I presume you don't collect exicati or postcards or stamps. How do you manage your interests?
I limited at the beginning. I limited my collection to books and papers, reprinted from journals as well. And I must say, at the beginning, I didn't have an idea how vast this field is. And so I collected many books, which I would never collect again today. And then I specialized more on the great iconographies and the milestones in mycology. That means all the books and smaller papers by Fries and the great mycologists of the times. And at let's say, when I published then my bibliography with an addenda, there were also some manuscripts. And at the end, I'm now a bit concentrating on books on truffles, my special interest also as an author. But it's a very vast field, and as a beginner, you don't know what is important. I had the opportunity to meet here in Hamburg Joachim Schliemann, who was also a great collector of mushroom books, with his with a special bibliography. And so I had my first experiences and my first ideas coming from someone else. But this was a time when you went to, if you wanted to look for mushroom books, you went to the antiquarian bookshops. And when I worked in Paris, my city map always was marked with the antiquarian bookshops.
Thank you.
Great question, Jason. Thanks. Corrado, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Here is Corrado Nai from Jakarta. I have a question to Christian Volbracht, and I would like to hear his opinion about the work of Mary Elizabeth Benning. Now, I'm fully aware her manuscript has never been published, but I think Mycophiles in New York might be interested to know more about her work, because her manuscript, Fungi in Maryland, has been donated at the end of the 19th century to Charles Peck, and is now in possession of the New York State Museum. So I was just interested to hear your opinion about this work and how it fits within these great examples that you showed about history of illustration in mycology.
Yeah, I didn't study the book by Manning in detail, but when I wrote in the last year a paper for the German scientific journal for mycology, on female illustrators of mushroom books, I clearly also had Manning in the paper with some pictures. I think there are, under all these illustrations by female illustrators, are many, many very interesting examples. Point of view, mycology, but also craftsmanship, graphic, etc. It's a shame that there are not more reproductions and of these illustrations.
Wonderful. Can you share with me maybe the link to your paper? And thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I can send you. I think you will find my address in on my website Mycolibri, and then send me your email. I can send a PDF of the paper. I hope you will manage to understand it because it's in German.
Yeah, ich spreche auch Deutsch, ja.
Wonderful.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Valerie, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Valerie, no, I'll ask you, Christian, your question. What technique of printing do you think preserves the integrity of the subject the best?
I think that I admire the most copper plates, hand-colored copper plates, but I must admit nowadays also printed photographs, etc., if they are done by a very experienced photographer and mycologist, they are very good. And this combined also with microphotos from the microscope, I think that's very important for science. But as a book lover and someone who can imagine all the work and all the speciality and craftsmanship, I admire most these hand-colored plates.
J.D. Schwartz, you have a question.
Joanne, oh, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much for the presentation. Over the decades, I've collected lots of Ernst Haeckel's work, and I know it's very sort of casual compared to some of what you're showing, but where does that fit in?
The Haeckel, I don't understand that question, right?
The artist, an artist. I'll put his name in the chat right now.
The Ernst Haeckel?
Haeckel, yeah.
Yeah.
You mean Kunstformen der Natur, artistical forms of nature. Yeah, these are absolutely great illustrations by Haeckel. You are right. Perhaps I should have mentioned him as well as an example, even if that is not a botanical and mycological book, but these are wonderful, great illustrations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Corrado, did you have another question or a follow-up question? I see your hand is up.
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to lower it. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, thanks. Christian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great pleasure for me. And if you want to see more photos, I invite you to go to my website. And even if someone is interested in books on truffles or the bibliography, just contact me. It's easy to find.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. This presentation was recorded, and it will be distributed to the participating clubs in the next few days. Christian, thank you very much. Great to
Yeah.
see you.
And thank you for your help
Bye.
and organization. Bye-bye.
Bye.